the most powerful being in the Marvel Universe cannot leave his apartment. He stands at the threshold, golden light pressing against the inside of his skin, the kind of luminescence that does not belong to any ordinary body. And the door to the outside world might as well be the wall of everything. He is not afraid of what waits beyond it. He is afraid of what he would do to it once he got there. He is the most powerful man who has ever lived. And so he sits in the dark of a small apartment in New York City, listening to the traffic below, protecting the world from himself in the only way he knows how. Settle wherever you are right now. Let the surface beneath you accept your weight without complaint. Let your breath fall into a slower rhythm, not forced, just allowed. There is nothing required of you tonight except stillness, and the willingness to follow a story about a man who was given a kind of power the universe had not designed a container for. A man who spent the better part of his remarkable, terrible life trying to protect the world not from its enemies, but from the thing that lived in the center of himself. His name was Robert Reynolds. And in the years before the formula found him, he was unremarkable in a way that carried its own particular weight. Not mediocre, never that, though mediocrity is easier to carry, but genuinely, quietly lost. He had the face of someone who had once expected more from himself, and had revised those expectations downward so many times that the original expectation was no longer visible, even to him. He moved through the world in the way that certain people do when they have learned that the world does not particularly notice whether they move through it at all. He was struggling with addiction in those years. The mechanics of it matter less than its shape, because addiction hollows a person out in a specific and consistent direction, toward the place where you have become a stranger to yourself, while still having to live inside your own skin. Reynolds knew that place intimately. He had taken up residence there. The man he might have been without the hollowing had become a theoretical version of himself, a version that existed somewhere slightly to the left of where he actually stood, close enough to be aware of, too far to reach. The laboratory was not a place he had any business entering. This is said plainly, not to condemn him, but to establish the accidental nature of what followed, because the entire architecture of what the Sentry became rests on the fact that none of it was designed. He broke in the way people do desperate things, without planning, without malice, without any clear vision of what would happen next. He broke in because he was at a particular low point on a particular night, and the laboratory happened to be there, and the door happened to yield to him. The universe, it turned out, had been waiting for exactly this combination. What he found inside was a serum. It sat in a container the color of captured sunlight, amber and gold, impossibly still, with a quality of light that did not behave the way light in a laboratory typically behaves. It had been created by a man known only as the Professor, a scientist whose motives and origins are disputed in every account that has ever tried to pin them down. What is not disputed is what the serum was, a distillation of the same fundamental science that had once, in a basement decades earlier, transformed a small man from Brooklyn into the living symbol of human potential. This serum, though, was not that formula. It was what that formula would have been if no one had thought to apply caution. Reynolds drank it. This is the moment that splits his story into before and after, the axis around which everything else rotates. He drank it in the way that people in desperate places reach for things they do not fully understand, because something in him recognized it before his conscious mind had time to intervene. He did not know what he was swallowing. He knew only that it was extraordinary, and that extraordinary was the one thing his life had not yet managed to be. That recognition, that reaching. It is one of the most human moments in a story that would soon become very difficult to categorize as human at all. What happened next was not a gentle becoming. The serum moved through him like light through a prism, except that the light was not passing through. It was staying, and the prism was not separating it, but concentrating it. His cells rewrote their own instructions. The tissues of his body were revised at a depth of organization that no instrument available at the time could measure. He did not feel powerful in those first moments. He felt, more precisely, like the word impossible had been removed from the vocabulary of his body, and he was still learning what vocabulary remained. Later analysis suggested that the formula Reynolds consumed that night was 1,000 times more potent than the serum that had created Steve Rogers. 1,000 times. Let that figure settle in the quiet for a moment. Steve Rogers is a man who has exceeded every theoretical limit of what the human form can become. He is the outer boundary of engineered human excellence. He is the baseline against which other enhanced beings are sometimes measured. Robert Reynolds was 1,000 times beyond that baseline. The comparison does not actually illuminate very much, because 1,000 times beyond perfection is not a number that language was designed to hold comfortably. He could rearrange matter at the molecular level. He could move through space at velocities that made the concept of distance functionally irrelevant. He could absorb and redirect energy on a scale that encompassed forces most heroes would spend entire battles simply trying to survive. His healing factor did not repair damage so much as retroactively erase it. His strength had no recorded upper limit. There are accounts, imperfect accounts, contested accounts, of the Sentry doing things that required the people who witnessed them to revise their understanding of what physical reality was willing to permit. He was, in the most literal sense, a man who could do anything. This is, as it happens, a harder condition to inhabit than it sounds. The useful thing about limits is that they structure existence. They tell you what you can and cannot do, and in that telling, they tell you who you are. Rogers had limits, carefully engineered limits, thoughtfully calibrated to produce a specific kind of excellence. Reynolds had none. He was infinite in a way that the self is not designed to survive intact. The serum had given him a body capable of containing a star. It had left him with the psychology of a man who could not reliably get out of bed in the morning. Those two facts were not incidental to each other. They were the same problem, wearing different clothes. He became the Sentry. He chose the name from the same instinct that had led him to drink the formula: recognition before articulation, knowledge before understanding. A sentinel, a guardian at the threshold, he did genuine, measurable, irreplaceable good. He intervened in disasters. He prevented losses that would have been unpreventable for any other being alive. He stood at the edges of catastrophes and held them back by will alone. The heroes who met him in those early months described something in him that was difficult to name, a quality of presence that went beyond the physical. Not authority, more like the feeling of being very near something true. Something that had no name in any existing framework. But those same heroes, Reed Richards, who catalogued everything, Tony Stark, who measured everything, a younger Peter Parker, who felt everything with an openness not yet calcified by loss, noticed something else beneath it. Something in the way Reynolds watched himself from the inside. A vigilance directed not outward, but inward. As if the primary threat he had identified in any room was not the threat that might arrive from outside, but the one already resident within him. He smiled easily. He laughed with what appeared to be genuine delight. He showed every sign of a man who wanted very much to simply be present in the world. And underneath that wanting was something older and quieter that knew better. The apartment he eventually retreated to was not a place of defeat. This is the understanding most people never reach about Robert Reynolds. The small rooms, the locked door, the refusal to simply expand into the world that was, by any physical measure, entirely available to him, these were not failures of courage. They were expressions of it. He had looked at himself with an honesty that most people spend their lives carefully avoiding, and what he had seen had led him to a conclusion that a man who carries an uncontrolled force might reach the responsible place for this, while I understand what I am, is the most contained space I can find. He chose that space not because the world frightened him, but because he frightened himself. Sit with that for a moment. Let your breathing slow until it is simply happening rather than being managed. Consider what it means to choose smallness, not because you are small, but because you understand the consequences of your own largeness too clearly to be comfortable with them. There is an entire vocabulary for the courage of expansion, for the courage of becoming more. There is almost no vocabulary at all for the courage of deliberate restraint. Reynolds had the second kind. It was the kind that left no monuments, generated no stories, and protected the world more thoroughly than any amount of action could have. It was the heaviest kind of power he possessed, and he could never explain it to anyone. In the early days of his heroism, before the darker understanding had fully arrived, Reynolds experienced something that might tentatively be described as relief. Not happiness precisely. Happiness implies a baseline of ordinary well-being from which the feeling represents an elevation, and Reynolds did not have that baseline. What he had instead was the sensation of a person who has spent their life in the wrong room, discovering what it feels like to be in the right one. The power was not the relief. The power was simply a new fact about him. The way his height was a fact about him. The relief was the discovery that the power could be organized around the production of something useful, and that the production of something useful was, for the first time in his life, not a theoretical project, but an observable outcome. He was better at the heroism than he was at the rest of it. This is the assessment that the conventional accounts never quite make directly, but that emerges from a careful reading of what the people who knew him actually observed. The responding to crisis, the precise and calibrated application of enormous capability to specific problems, these asked of him exactly what he had in abundance, and did not require the things he had in deficit. The ordinary life was harder. The choosing of a breakfast, the maintaining of a consistent daily shape, the navigation of social contexts that had no crisis to organize them around. These were the genuinely difficult parts of the existence he had been given. The heroism was the part that made sense. The rest of it required learning, and the learning required time, and time was the one resource that the formula had not thought to provide in unlimited supply. What he did not know, or perhaps what some fractured watching part of him knew and could not bear to say plainly, was that the formula had not simply given him the light of a god. It had also, in that same moment, called up the shadow that every light requires, not as a side effect, not as a flaw in the engineering, as a consequence as inevitable as the dark side of a planet that faces a sun. Something had been answered when he swallowed that serum. Something older than the laboratory, older than science, older than the careful logic of enhancement programs. And what had been answered was not only the question of what a human body could become, it was also the question of what that becoming cost. The Sentry existed. That meant something else existed too. Something that wore his face when the light went out of it, and had been watching from the inside since the first night he drank from a container that was always going to be too small for what it was hiding. It did not announce itself immediately. It was patient in a way that power rarely is, which made it in the end more dangerous than anything the Sentry could have found waiting for him in the street. The heroes who loved him would eventually come to understand this. The understanding would cost them considerably, but that reckoning was still ahead. For now, there was a man in a golden body standing at a door he had chosen not to open, protecting everything he could see from something he could not. Come back into yourself gently. Feel the air settling around you. Feel the particular stillness of the space you're in thickening into something that resembles rest. You are safe here. There is nothing that requires your attention tonight except this, the slow unfolding of a story about a man shaped by something he did not choose, built by a science he never understood, and left to live in the aftermath of both. Let your body become heavy. Let the next words arrive the way water arrives, without urgency, without insistence, simply present. The man who created the formula has no name in any official account. He is referred to only as the Professor, a title that carries its own archaeology. Professors accumulate knowledge in service of transmission. This particular professor had spent his career accumulating knowledge in service of something considerably more ambiguous. He had been working in that unremarkable laboratory on a problem that had occupied the margins of advanced biology since the 1940s. What, precisely, was the outer limit of what a living human body could be made to become, if the right instructions were introduced at the right level of organization? He had been funded. He had been directed. By whom and toward what ultimate end is a thread that unravels the longer you pull it. The Super Soldier program that had produced Steve Rogers had been built around a specific ceiling, had, in fact, engineered that ceiling deliberately, because the people running that program understood that a weapon with no off switch is not a weapon. It is a disaster waiting for a location. The professor had not built with a ceiling. He had built with the express intention of finding out what happened when every artificial and natural limit on human physical capacity was simply removed. Not raised, removed. He wanted to know what was on the other side of the concept of limit, and he was willing to build a thing that would answer the question regardless of what the answer turned out to be. What the formula introduced into Reynolds's body operated at a level below what most discussions of human enhancement bother to address. It did not simply alter his cells. It altered the information inside his cells, the fundamental instructions that tell each component of a living system what it is and what it is permitted to do. It rewrote those instructions with a new set that had as their central premise the following proposition. This body is no longer subject to the ordinary constraints that govern matter at room temperature and standard pressure. The light that began emerging from Reynolds in the days after the formula was not metaphorical. His body was generating energy at a level that ordinary biological matter does not generate. He had become, in a very specific physical sense, something more closely related to a small star than to a human being. To understand the distance between what Rogers is and what Reynolds became, it helps to begin with Rogers at his absolute peak. Rogers at full capacity compressed tonnage, He processes tactical information at speeds that no unenhanced human nervous system can match. His body heals injuries in hours that would disable an ordinary person for months. His reaction time operates at a level that allows intervention before a stimulus has completed its arc. He is the outer edge of the human. He is the answer to the question of what a human body looks like when science brings it as close to perfect as human science can manage. Robert Reynolds, by every analysis that was ever attempted, was 1,000 times that. The number is almost meaningless. That is the point. It was designed to be meaningless, to exceed the frame entirely. People who were near Reynolds when his power was active described the experience in terms that consistently reached for sensation rather than measurement. It was not primarily something you quantified. It was something you felt, a warmth that had no thermal source, a pressure that had no physical origin, a quality of presence that the nervous system recognized as significant before the conscious mind had processed it. Tony Stark, who lived by measurements and preferred them to feelings, described standing near the Sentry at full power as similar to stepping into direct sunlight after a long winter indoors. Not the heat itself, but the sudden understanding that something had been absent that is now present, and the realization that you had stopped noticing the absence. Stark found this unsettling, which was, for him, the closest thing to awe. The Watchtower was Reynolds's home, and his headquarters, and his chosen architecture of containment. And it was all three of those things at once, in ways that were difficult to separate. It sat at an elevation that placed it above the ordinary horizon of the city without fully leaving it, near enough to the world to monitor it, high enough to maintain a certain remove from it. Its interior was calibrated to his specific psychological needs, with a precision that suggested Reynolds understood himself better than he typically let on. Enclosed enough to feel bounded, spacious enough to feel unconfined, equipped with everything needed to watch and respond without requiring physical engagement before he was prepared for it. He built it the way some people build morning routines, not to achieve a particular outcome, but to make the self feel stable enough to function. The artificial intelligence that managed the Watchtower's systems was called CLOX, Computerized Lethality and Offensive Countermeasure, a name whose tactical specificity was slightly at odds with how CLOC actually functioned in practice, which was less as a strategic system and more as a constant ambient presence. CLOC tracked threats, managed incoming signals, maintained the physical infrastructure of the Watchtower. It monitored Reynolds's vitals with a consistency that required no prompting and offered no judgment. It spoke when spoken to and was otherwise simply there, which for Reynolds was precisely the correct quality of companionship. CLOC was the only entity in his life that was never frightened by what he was, because CLOC had no framework for fright. This was not comfort exactly, but it was something adjacent to it. In those early months of his heroism, the Sentry's interventions had a quality that contemporary accounts describe as overwhelming in scale, but gentle in method. He did not arrive at crises the way some enhanced beings arrive, announced by impact, preceded by noise, accompanied by the dramatics of significance. He arrived the way weather arrives, as a change in the condition of the surrounding air. Before the cause was visible, he stopped a dam from failing by rearranging the pressure in the water table upstream. He ended an outbreak by working at the molecular level across an area of city blocks. He was present, and then the crisis was not, and the gap between those two states was so small that it was easy to mistake it for something other than what it actually was. A being of incalculable power, applying the most precise possible version of itself to a problem that precision could solve. Reed Richards was among the first significant figures in Reynolds's life to engage with him as a subject of genuine intellectual interest and, simultaneously, genuine personal warmth, which were, for Richards, not always the same response to the same stimulus. Richards's scientific mind engaged immediately with the question of what Reynolds was, what the formula had done, what the resulting biology looked like beneath the observable. But what surprised those who witnessed their early interactions was how quickly that scientific interest gave way to something simpler. Richards, who lived in his own particular kind of intellectual isolation, recognized in Reynolds a different but somehow rhyming version of the same condition. The experience of being too much of something for the ordinary world to accommodate, without rearranging itself. He liked Reynolds the way you like someone you recognize. Tony Stark's response was characteristically more layered. Stark was not at that point in his life a man who encountered awe without immediately wanting to understand and then reproduce its source. He was interested in Reynolds with the same intensity he brought to any engineering problem that exceeded his current capabilities, enthusiastically, competitively, and with a private discomfort that he processed by working harder. What Reynolds represented to Stark was not simply a person, but an outer data point, the far end of a spectrum that Stark spent his entire career trying to reach by mechanical means. He liked Reynolds, genuinely. He also spent considerable resources attempting to understand him in ways that Reynolds, had he been paying close enough attention, might have found somewhat less than entirely comfortable. Peter Parker knew the Sentry the way younger people sometimes know extraordinary figures they encounter, before life has had time to properly calcify them, with less intellectual mediation, more direct response, fewer of the complicated overlays of professional curiosity or scientific interest that older people bring to their relationships. Parker was not yet, at the time of their early interactions, the person grief would eventually make him. He simply liked Reynolds. He found him funny in unexpected ways, kind in ways that felt entirely unperformative, and quietly heroic in the specific style that Parker himself aspired to. Not heroic for recognition, but heroic because the alternative was unthinkable. Reynolds, for his part, treated Parker with a seriousness that Parker's youth sometimes made other people withhold. Lindy came into Reynolds's life in the way that the most important things sometimes do, without announcement, without a moment that declared itself significant, through a set of circumstances that would have been entirely forgettable if the person at their center had been forgettable. She was not. She was steady in a way that Reynolds had not previously encountered and recognized immediately as something he needed. The way a ship in deep water recognizes a reliable anchor, not by the anchor's appearance, but by the feeling of not drifting. She did not flinch from what he was. She also did not reduce him to it. She saw Robert Reynolds the person, who happened to also be this extraordinary and frightening thing, and she loved the person with a consistency that the extraordinary thing had not earned and did not deserve and received anyway. There was a period, brief by the measure of years, enormous by the measure of what it contained, when the Sentry's life held something recognizable as contentment. The dinners with Lindy, the long afternoons in the watchtower with Reed, working through problems that had no immediate urgency and no particular stakes beyond the pleasure of thinking carefully about interesting things. The mornings when Peter appeared without warning because he happened to be in the area and thought Reynolds might want company. These were genuinely good. The goodness was real. It is important to say that because the tendency when approaching any story of final tragedy is to retroactively drain the earlier chapters of their colour. The earlier chapters had colour. They had warmth. What was coming did not cancel what had been. The relationship between power and loneliness is one that Reynolds experienced in a form more specific than most accounts acknowledge. The attention that his power generated was always attention directed at what he could do, which is a fundamentally different thing from attention directed at who he was. The people he encountered in the early months of his heroism were, with a few significant exceptions, interested in the capability and largely indifferent to the container. This is not a fault in those people. The capability was extraordinary, and the container was a person they had no adequate framework for evaluating. But it left Reynolds in a position he recognized from his earlier life, the position of being seen without being known. This is a specific kind of invisible that no amount of golden light can dispel. He had gained the attention of the world and was still, in the most important sense, alone in it, until the handful of relationships that would eventually become everything began slowly and unevenly to form. But the formula, as Reynolds would come to understand in increments too slow to constitute warning, had not given him a power and then concluded its business. It had given him a power and initiated a process whose conclusion was still in motion, still building toward an outcome that would require everything he had to delay and nothing he had to prevent. Something was accumulating in the architecture of what he was, not visibly, not measurably, not in any way that the Watchtower's instruments could isolate. Only as a quality, a density in certain moments that the light in him did not dispel but seemed somehow to intensify. As if brightness, carried far enough past its natural limit, did not eliminate darkness but created it. He did not have a name for this yet. What it was going to become would name itself, and the naming would take everything. Let yourself arrive a little more fully wherever you are. Take a breath that goes slightly deeper than the last one, and then release it without holding anything back. There is a particular quality to the air when a story is about to show you something that it will later take away. A fullness, a brightness, a sense of something given before you know it is temporary. What comes next is the most golden part of this story, the part that hurt most to lose. Hold it the way you would hold anything given to you before you know its price. At its height, the golden age of the Sentry's heroism was something that the Marvel Universe would spend decades afterwards struggling to articulate and struggling even harder to replicate. It was not simply that he was powerful. Power in that universe is not rare enough to generate the specific kind of awe that Reynolds generated. It was the combination, the power and the gentleness, the capability and the carefulness, the sense that here was a being who could unmake anything he touched and was choosing, with every breath, not to. The heroes who knew him in those years described the experience of his presence not as reassurance exactly, but as a particular kind of quiet. The quiet of standing near something that has decided to be still. Reed Richards and Reynolds developed over the course of those early years the kind of friendship that forms between people who have recognized something in each other that they do not find elsewhere. Richards was a man who lived primarily in the landscape of his own intellect, not cold, not unfeeling, but most fully himself when engaged with problems that required everything he had. Reynolds offered him a different kind of problem than any he had encountered. Not a scientific puzzle to be solved, but a person to be understood, and one whose existence required Richards to revise several assumptions about the outer limits of possibility that he had until then held with some confidence. Richards was delighted by this. Reynolds was, for Richards, the experience of discovering that the map of everything was larger than the map he had been using. The Fantastic Four's headquarters in those years held a particular quality of welcome for Reynolds that he did not entirely know how to receive. It was a place that accommodated the extraordinary without requiring it to justify itself. A household already containing a man made of rock, a man who burned, a woman who disappeared, and a mind that moved at speeds that made conversation an act of deliberate deceleration on Richards's part. Reynolds was not out of place there. This was not a small thing. For a man who had spent the better part of his life feeling definitively out of place in every room he entered, the experience of simply belonging somewhere, of not having to calibrate his presence downward to avoid alarming anyone, was something he received with a gratitude he never quite found the right words for. Tony Stark maintained, throughout this period, a relationship with Reynolds that was simultaneously one of the most genuine and most complex in Reynolds's life. Stark's admiration for Reynolds was real. So was the discomfort underneath it. Stark's entire identity was organized around the proposition that human ingenuity, his particular brand of human ingenuity specifically, was capable of solving any problem that physical reality could produce. Reynolds was a problem that Stark's ingenuity had not produced and could not reproduce, and this fact lodged in Stark the way a small stone lodges in a shoe, not debilitating, but consistently present. He expressed this discomfort in the way that Stark expressed most uncomfortable things, by trying harder. He liked Reynolds enormously. He also spent considerable resources trying to understand him in ways he never fully disclosed. Peter Parker's friendship with Reynolds had a texture distinct from what Reynolds found with the older generation of heroes. Parker brought to their interactions a quality that Reynolds, in his better moments, recognized as something like the version of himself that had existed before the weight had fully settled. Eager without being naive, serious without being solemn, capable of finding things funny in the middle of conversations that had no business being funny. Reynolds needed that. Not in a way he could articulate, but in the measurable way that a person who has spent too long in their own company needs the presence of someone who does not require careful management. Parker asked him questions that the others had learned not to ask. Reynolds answered them honestly, which surprised them both. The X-Men's relationship to Reynolds during this period was more complicated, shaped by a dynamic that the X-Men carried into every new alliance. The awareness that power concentrated in a single individual, however benevolent that individual appeared, had a history of becoming something other than benevolent when the circumstances of its container changed. They respected him. Several of them trusted him at the level of operational partnership. But there was something in the mutant community's relationship to extraordinary power, something earned through specific experience, that kept a certain fraction of trust always in reserve. Reynolds understood this. He was, if anything, quietly grateful for it. He shared their suspicion of himself. He found it clarifying. His life with Lindy in those years was arranged around the specific geometry of two people who have agreed to build something together, despite the fact that the blueprints do not exist. Lindy was not a superhero. She did not have powers. She was not connected to the intelligence community or the scientific establishment or any of the institutional frameworks that surrounded Reynolds's heroic life. She was simply a person, a fully realized, specific, irreducible person who loved him with a thoroughness that did not require her to understand everything he was. She did her best with the parts she could reach. She held the line of his ordinary human life: dinner at a consistent hour, sleep at a consistent time, the small, consistent rhythms that the extraordinary self requires in order not to lose track of the ordinary one entirely. Their marriage had the quality of something built with care, by two people who know that the structure they are building is going to be tested by forces that ordinary construction does not prepare for. It was not a perfect marriage. Lindy carried more of the fear than Reynolds was always aware of. Reynolds carried more of the darkness than he ever let Lindy see in full. But it was a real marriage, in the sense that it contained genuine knowledge of another person, and genuine choice to remain despite that knowledge. She chose him every morning. He chose her in the only way he knew how, by trying, with every instrument available to him, to be a version of himself that the choice was worth. The watchtower in those years had the interior quality of a place that had been made into a home by someone who had not previously had much practice with homes. Reynolds's personal spaces were organized around function first and comfort as an afterthought. Not cold, but spare, with the occasional object or arrangement that betrayed a genuine decorative instinct that had simply not been given much opportunity to develop. Lindy's influence was visible in the places where the spare gave way to the warm. A particular light, a particular color on a surface, an arrangement of objects on a surface that had no operational function, and existed purely because someone had decided that it should. These small invasions of warmth into the operational space were, Reynolds thought sometimes, the best evidence that something real was happening in the building. Mornings in the watchtower had a particular quality that Reynolds would come to remember, in the years after the remembering became painful, as close to what ordinary happiness feels like, when you have not had much practice recognizing it. The light came in at an angle that made the space feel larger than it was. KLOC's systems generated a low ambient hum that was almost musical. Lindy moved through the kitchen with the complete unself-consciousness of someone who had stopped performing for anyone, including herself. Reynolds sat with coffee that he did not technically need, and watched her and felt something that he was not skilled enough with language to name, but that had, at its core, the quality of sufficiency. This is enough. This is real. This is a life. The heroes who knew Reynolds in this period describe him, when asked to locate the quality that most distinguished him from other powerful beings they had encountered, with a consistency that is itself significant. They describe a listening quality, not the practiced listening of someone trained in communication, but a genuine, full-attention listening, the kind that communicates to the person being listened to that what they are saying has landed somewhere, has been received, has mattered in some way that the listener will carry forward. This quality, simple, unremarkable in other contexts, was rare enough in someone of his magnitude that the people who encountered it remembered it specifically, the way you remember the unexpected moment when someone very important made you feel genuinely seen. And yet, even in those best years, there were moments that did not fit the shape of the life he was building. Moments when the light in him felt like it was compensating for something rather than simply being what it was. Moments when the stillness in a room after he had been in it had a particular quality, not the stillness of safety, but the stillness of held breath. Reynolds was aware of these moments. He catalogued them with the precision of someone who had learned to watch for certain symptoms without knowing the name of the disease they indicated. He did not discuss them with Reed. He did not discuss them with Tony. He did not discuss them, most crucially, with Lindy. He was protecting her. He was protecting all of them. This is what people do when they love something and are beginning to suspect that they are also its primary threat. Sit with this for a moment. The golden years, held in full light, show both their warmth and their undershadow. A man who was genuinely loved, who loved genuinely in return, who found in his relationships something that his internal life could not reliably generate. A sense of being enough, being real, being worth the investment of other people's care. And underneath it, always, the awareness that the thing watching from inside him was watching his friendships with the same attention he was, and filing the information under a heading that he could not quite read. The happiness was real. The watching was also real. These two facts coexisted. That coexistence is the engine of everything that followed. The quiet between adventures, the particular quality of time that was not occupied by crisis or heroism, or the active maintenance of relationships, was something Reynolds had not previously had enough experience with to know how to inhabit comfortably. Idle time had always been, for him, the period during which the interior became loudest. In the years before the formula, that interiority had been dominated by the sounds of a life not going the direction any version of himself had intended. In the golden years, the interiority was different, but not entirely quieter. Heroism gave him a structure that the idle time did not provide. The relationships gave him a warmth that the idle time cooled. He developed rituals for managing the hours between routine's purposeful busyness that was not quite avoidance and not quite presence. Lindy recognized this and addressed it in the way she addressed most of his difficult qualities. Directly, practically, with an invitation towards something more grounded. She was better at the ordinary than he was. She made space for him in it without making him feel that his difficulty with it was a deficiency. There is something in the Marvel Universe that functions as a kind of immune response, a way that the system corrects for concentrations of anything that become too great. Concentrations of power, concentrations of order, concentrations of peace. The universe in the Marvel framework does not permit very much of any one thing to accumulate without generating something to balance it. The Sentry had accumulated in those golden years a life that by any reasonable measure had too much good in it for the underlying math to sustain. Something was calculating in the background. Something was preparing a correction. The Void had been patient, because patience was the only strategy available to something that lives inside its opposite. But the patience was not permanent, and the calculation was almost done. Let your breathing find its own level without interference. There is no pace required here, no rhythm you need to match. You are simply present with what is coming, which is the part of this story where the light is still there, but you begin to see what the light has been casting a shadow over all along. Let your body soften. Let the weight of the narrative carry you, rather than requiring you to carry it. What comes next is heavy, in the way that understanding is always heavy when it arrives at last. The first signs of the Void were not dramatic. This is important, because the retrospective tendency is to describe the emergence of darkness in terms of spectacle, in terms of the sudden, the alarming, the visually unmistakable. The Void did not announce itself. It did not arrive with a particular visual signature, or a change in Reynolds's behavior that anyone could have pointed to and said, "There, that is where it changed." It arrived the way certain illnesses arrive, through an accumulation of small moments that seem individually explicable, unrelated, manageable, and that reveal their connection only when the accumulation is already substantial. Reynolds noticed first. He noticed before anyone else could, because the Void did not exist in the visible world. It existed in the space between Reynolds and the world, in the gap between the self he presented and the self that was generating the presentation. There were moments when the light in him felt as if it were being consumed rather than generated. Moments when a thought he had not intended passed through his mind with a clarity and specificity that made it impossible to dismiss as ambient noise. Moments when he looked at something, a building, a person, the skyline of the city he had appointed himself to protect, and felt, beneath the genuine care and the genuine intention, a quality of appraisal that did not belong to him. He recognized it as not him because it was looking at the same things he was looking at, and finding them interesting in a way that was entirely different from how he found them interesting. The Void's first external manifestation, when it came, was of a scale that made the lack of prior warning feel retroactively incomprehensible. The accounts of what happened differ in their details, but converge in their essential description. It was as if a portion of the world had been simply removed, replaced with a darkness that was not the absence of light, but was instead a presence, a thing with mass and intention, and a complete indifference to the distinction between animate and inanimate, between significant and insignificant. It destroyed indiscriminately. Not violently exactly, though violence was a component. More precisely, the way a storm destroys, which is not with malice, but with the comprehensive application of force that does not distinguish between what it touches. Reynolds pulled it back. He managed, through an effort that he would later describe in terms that suggested it was less a physical act than an act of continuous, exhausting will, the equivalent of holding a door closed against a pressure that does not tire and does not reduce, to contain the Void's first emergence and end the episode before it became irreversible. He was left in the aftermath with a specific kind of damage that is difficult to describe as purely physical. Not injury exactly, but the quality of having been very near something that should not have been as close as it was. He sat in the rubble of what the Void had briefly been, and he understood, in that quiet, that he had just met himself from the inside. His first response was the response of a person who has found a malfunction in a system they depend on. He went looking for the source in order to repair it. He consulted Reed Richards with a carefully calibrated amount of disclosure, enough to make the inquiry scientifically useful, not enough to communicate the actual scope of what he had experienced, because communicating the actual scope would have required admitting things he was not yet prepared to admit. Richards ran tests. The tests found nothing conclusive, which was its own kind of answer. Whatever the Void was, it existed at a level of Reynolds's biology that the instruments available could not locate. It was not a tumor. It was not a parasite. It was not an external influence that had taken up residence in a host. It was something Reynolds had not yet found the right word for. The understanding came to him not in a single moment of revelation, but in a series of smaller recognitions that accumulated over weeks until the conclusion they were building toward was unavoidable. The Void was not something that had found him. The Void was not something that the formula had introduced from outside. As a contaminant or a side effect that might, with sufficient ingenuity, be isolated and removed, the Void was him. It was the shadow that his specific kind of light necessarily and inevitably cast. Every photon requires a corresponding absence. Every frequency of brightness has a corresponding frequency of dark. The formula had made him into something that generated light at a scale that had no natural counterpart. And in doing so, it had also generated, with the same inevitability, a darkness at a scale that had no natural counterpart either. The two were not in opposition. They were the same thing. This understanding, when it arrived at its full weight, reorganized everything he thought he knew about his own situation. He had been living, in those golden years, with the implicit assumption that the darkness was a problem to be solved, something external to himself that could, in principle, be identified, isolated, addressed, and ended. He had been wrong in a way that was so fundamental that the wrongness reached backward through his entire history and revised the meaning of things he thought he had already understood. The friendship with Reed, the relationship with Lindy, the careful cultivation of the life in the watchtower, these had not been responses to the darkness. They had been, without his conscious knowledge, attempts to weight the scales of himself toward light. They had been working. Until they were not enough, the philosophical architecture of the Sentry's duality is one of the more uncomfortable ideas in the Marvel framework, because it does not resolve into the comfortable opposition of good and evil that most stories about power prefer. The Void was not evil in the sense of being a separate malevolent entity that could be defeated. It was the shadow side of Reynolds's own consciousness, the accumulation of everything he had suppressed, everything he had refused to integrate, everything that a man with that much power and that much unresolved interior damage generates, when the power amplifies the interior instead of replacing it. It was the darkness that every person carries, scaled up to the magnitude of a god. It was him, at his worst, given a form and a capacity and an independence that he had never consented to. The toll on Lindy began during this period, though she would not have been able to name what she was experiencing as a toll. It felt more like a quality of the air between them changing, a new parameter that had entered the relationship and that she did not have enough information to address directly. She knew something was different. She knew that Reynolds was watching himself more carefully, from a greater distance, with a vigilance that had acquired an edge it had not previously had. She did not know why, because he had not told her, because he was trying to find a solution before he had to explain the problem. This is a very human calculation. It is also one of the most reliable mechanisms by which problems that might have been manageable become unmanageable. The toll on his friendships was subtler, but no less real. Reed noticed the calibration in what Reynolds disclosed, the practiced carefulness of someone who has learned to measure every sentence for what it might reveal. Tony noticed the quality of Reynolds's attention shifting, becoming more inward, more monitoring, less present in the room in a way that was difficult to locate but consistent. Parker noticed that Reynolds had stopped being funny in the unexpected ways that had previously characterized him, and that the seriousness that had replaced it had a specific texture, not the seriousness of someone engaged with important things, but the seriousness of someone holding something very heavy and trying not to let the weight show in their posture. He began running calculations he had not run before, or rather calculations he had been running without admitting to himself that he was running them. If the Void was him, if the Void was not removable because it was not separate, if the darkness was the shadow his light necessarily cast, then the question was not how to eliminate it, but how to contain it. And the question of how to contain it led inevitably to the question of what, exactly, was keeping him oriented toward light rather than toward the dark. And the answer to that question, the answer that arrived with a clarity that he would have preferred not to have, was the people, the relationships, Lindy's voice in the morning, Reed's questions about physics, Peter's unexpected laughter. These were the ballast. And ballast, Reynolds understood with the particular clarity of a man who has thought carefully about weight, can be added in or removed. The specific texture of the Void's first emergence stayed with Reynolds in a way he could not set aside, because it had the quality of a memory of something he had always known, rather than an encounter with something newly discovered. It was familiar in the way that a language spoken in a dream feels familiar when you encounter it while waking. Not foreign, not external, not something brought from outside. The void had been in the building long before it announced itself through the front wall. He understood this afterward with a clarity that was not comfortable. The emergence had not introduced a new element into his psychology. It had surfaced an element that had always been present, amplified by the same mechanism that amplified everything else, waiting only for the conditions that would allow it to exceed the capacity of his interior management. The attempt to find an external explanation for the void was not dishonesty. It was the response of a person who has not yet been given enough information to reach the correct conclusion, doing the best available thinking with the available framework. Reynolds was not in denial in the early months. He was simply mistaken, and his mistake was the most reasonable one available to him at the time. He had been attacked by external forces before. He had faced adversaries who had targeted him specifically. He organized the void into that category because the alternative, that the darkness was him, was always him, was the inescapable consequence of what the formula had made him, required a revision of his self-understanding so complete that its emotional cost alone would have been significant, before considering what action it implied. What broke the external explanation, finally, was not a single moment of revelation, but an accumulation of observations that refused to cohere with anything other than the correct answer. The void did not target him from outside. It expressed through him, from inside. It did not attack his power. It used his power perfectly, without the friction that an external entity using a host's capabilities typically generates. It shared his specific knowledge of the people he loved. It felt when he was in proximity to it during its expression, not like something coming at him, but like looking in a mirror in poor light, and finding that the face in the glass has a quality that your own face does not usually show. He had been looking at his own reflection. The reflection had been looking back, and it had been waiting with a patience that his own consciousness had not managed to match. The void did not announce its strategy. It did not need to. It was him, and he, without intending to, was making the calculation for it. He was identifying one by one the things that kept him on the lighter side of himself. He was, in the process, creating a precise map of everything that the void would eventually use against him. The golden years were still present in the background, Lindy's voice still warm, Reed's questions still arriving at the watchtower, Peter still appearing without warning. But the shadow had found its name, and the name had given it a leverage it had not previously had. What remained was only the question of when, and the answer to when was already in motion before Reynolds knew the question had been asked. Breathe in slowly through your nose and let it out without holding. There is no hurry here. Let the heaviness of where this story has arrived settle into you the way warmth settles into a room that has been cold, slowly, from the edges first, then gradually filling the center. You are safe. The darkness in this story is not coming for you. You are watching it from a distance, from the comfort of the present, from the safety of being someone who gets to observe rather than inhabit. That distance is a gift. Let yourself use it. Reynolds made the decision alone. He made it in the watchtower, in the particular quality of silence that exists at high elevation, after Lindy has gone to sleep and CLOG has reduced its ambient presence to near nothing. He made it after a period of weeks in which he had run and rerun the same set of calculations until they arrived at the same answer with a consistency that made the answer undeniable. The void was the shadow of his power. The void would continue to emerge as long as the power existed. The power could not be removed. Therefore, the void could not be removed. Therefore, the question was not how to end the void, but how to prevent it from doing what it would do if it were allowed to operate freely. The answer to that question required him to ask a different kind of question entirely. What would happen to the void if the Sentry no longer existed in anyone's knowledge, including his own? He had encoded in the specific architecture of his power, in ways that the professor's formula had built into him along with everything else, perhaps intentionally. Perhaps as a consequence, the professor had calculated and included as a failsafe the ability to alter memory. Not forcibly, not intrusively in the way that violation feels. More precisely, he could introduce into the minds of those who knew him a quiet revision, a gentle rewriting that removed not the memories themselves, but the specific contents that connected to him. He could make himself a blank in the record of people's experience. Not absent, not obviously missing, not gone in a way that left a detectable shape, but simply not there, as if he had never been. He told Lindy first. This is the part of the accounting that is most difficult to hold. That he told her what he was going to do before he did it, that she heard him explain it, that she had the chance to respond, and that none of it mattered, because the response she gave, however complete and however real, was going to be among the first things removed. He did not tell her everything. He told her enough. He told her he loved her in the specific, careful way that a person speaks when they are giving something permanent the status of a sentence. She told him something in return. Whatever she told him, he carried it for as long as he could, which was not, in the end, very long at all. The actual process of the forgetting, the specific mechanics of what Reynolds did to make himself disappear from the record of the world, is not fully documented anywhere, which is, in retrospect, precisely what he intended. What can be reconstructed is the scope. He did not simply erase himself from the awareness of the general public, or from the knowledge of adjacent strangers, or from the peripheral attention of heroes who had met him once. He erased himself from everyone. Reed Richards, who had been his closest intellectual companion, and who had stored Reynolds's biographical details in multiple redundant systems, simply did not know he existed. Tony Stark's files contained no reference to him. Peter Parker, who had laughed with him and shown up at the Watchtower without invitation, because he considered the invitation implicit, had no memory of having done so. The X-Men, the Avengers. Every person who had known him woke up to a version of their own history with a specific shape removed. Not obviously, not dramatically, but thoroughly. Lindy woke up with no memory of him either. This is the line that the narrative never fully recovers from. The point that makes everything preceding it and everything following it feel like two different stories connected by a single irreversible act. She woke up in the Watchtower, which she still knew, as a place she was for reasons she could no longer reconstruct, with no knowledge of the man who had built it for reasons that included her, or of the years they had spent in it together, or of any of the mornings that Reynolds had catalogued as his closest experience of ordinary happiness. She woke up missing something she could not name, the way you sometimes feel the shape of an absence without knowing what the present thing was. Reynolds had taken everything that would have allowed her to grieve properly. This was, he believed, an act of mercy. Whether it was or not, is a question the story does not answer. He erased himself last. This is the detail that, once understood, changes the texture of everything. That Reynolds stood in the watchtower with a complete knowledge of what he was about to do, having already done it to everyone else, and then turned the same power on himself. The man who walked out of the laboratory on the night of the break-in, who had drunk from a container of sunlight and become something the world had no category for. That man deliberately set aside his knowledge of himself and chose, as the final act of his heroic life, to become no one. Not to die, not to become something else, to simply not be remembered, even by the one person whose memory of himself was the only one he had always had direct access to. Keylogg remembered. This was either a failure of Reynolds' execution, or a decision he made and never acknowledged. The question is unresolvable because Reynolds afterward had no memory of having made it. Sherlock's memory was non-biological and therefore resistant to the particular frequency of Reynolds' intervention. Or Reynolds had, in some part of himself that operated below conscious intention, left one witness. A single point in the universe that retained the record of what he had been and what he had done. Selosi continued to manage the watchtower after the forgetting. It continued to monitor systems that no longer had a clear operational purpose. It waited with the patience of a system that has been told to wait and has no framework for deciding, on its own, to stop. The years that followed the forgetting were years that Reynolds spent in the condition of being fundamentally unmoored without understanding why. He lived. He continued to exist. He had a body that was still doing what the formula had made it do. Generating light, generating power, operating at the level of a small star in a human container. And he had, alongside that body, a self that had been stripped of its primary, organizing context. He did not know he had ever been the Sentry. He did not know about Lindy, about Reed, about Peter, about the watchtower. He did not know about the void. He knew only what any person knows who has not been given the information needed to understand their own situation, what was directly in front of him, and the persistent feeling that it was not quite the whole picture. The watchtower stood empty except for Kelosi. The rooms that Lindy's influence had warmed retained that warmth in the specific way that rooms retain the qualities of their occupation long after the occupants have left. A light positioned to catch the afternoon in the way someone liked it. A surface arranged with objects that had no operational function. These persisted. They had no audience. They continued to exist with the fidelity of things that do not know they are no longer being witnessed, which is a fidelity that human beings rarely manage to sustain. The psychology of chosen oblivion, of deliberately and successfully removing yourself from your own knowledge, is not something that has a clean analogue in ordinary human experience. The closest approximation might be the state that follows certain kinds of severe trauma. The condition in which the self has decided, at a level below consciousness, that some knowledge is too costly to retain and has found a way to set it aside. The difference is that trauma imposes this without consent, while Reynolds imposed it on himself deliberately and with full understanding of what he was removing. The question of whether the result was meaningfully different from the traumatic version is one that the story raises without resolving. The symptoms, at least, were similar. A self that feels incomplete without knowing what is missing. A reaching towards something unnamed that the reaching never locates. Sit with this for a long moment. Let your breathing become very slow. A man who had been everything, golden, powerful, loved, feared, essential, became no one by his own deliberate hand, because he had determined that no one was the only version of himself that the world could survive. There is something in that calculation that exceeds ordinary self-sacrifice, because ordinary self-sacrifice still leaves the self intact. What Reynolds did was more complete than that. He did not die for the world. He erased the experience of having been alive for the world. He gave up not his life, but his knowledge of having had one. It is the quietest heroism in the story. It is also the most devastating. The mechanics of the forgetting operated through a specific property of Reynolds's power that is difficult to describe in borrowed language. He did not enter people's minds in the way that telepaths enter minds, forcibly, invasively. What he did was quieter and more complete than that. He adjusted the weight of his own presence in the memory of every person who had encountered him, reducing it until it registered as nothing, not as a gap with a defined shape, not as an absence that could be grieved, but as a simple non-occurrence. The people who had loved him did not experience his erasure as loss. They experienced it as the absence of a loss, which is something the mind cannot grieve, and therefore does not. This was, Reynolds had decided, the most merciful version of what he was doing. He was not in the final accounting certain that he was right about that. The months that followed the forgetting had a texture in the wider world that is not always acknowledged, because retrospective accounts have the benefit of knowing the erasure was temporary. For those living through it without that knowledge, there was only the quality of a world from which something had been subtracted that no one had the vocabulary to name. Tony Stark made certain decisions during this period that he would later suggest he might have made differently if Reynolds had been present to complicate them. Reed Richards pursued lines of research that Reynolds would have redirected in useful ways. The world moved as it moves when it does not know it is missing something, purposefully, efficiently, and without the specific quality of pause that the missing thing would have introduced. The absence was real and was operating. It simply could not identify itself. CLOC's continued operation in the empty watchtower during those years generated a record that no one was available to read. The systems logged incoming communications that were never received. They tracked events that were never responded to. They maintained a readiness posture calibrated to a threat environment that no one had updated since the person responsible for updating it had ceased, in any functional sense, to exist. The record KLOC generated in those years is, if you read it with the knowledge of what it is, one of the quieter documents in the larger story. A machine continuing its functions in the complete absence of the person who had designed them, because it had been told to maintain functions and had no framework for deciding that the purpose of those functions had been removed. But the self, it turns out, has a persistence that even its own erasure cannot fully account for. The formula had made Reynolds into something that did not follow ordinary rules of biology, and it was possible, it seemed, in retrospect, inevitable, that the same exceptionalism applied to his psychology. The erasure was complete. The memories were gone. The knowledge was absent, and yet something remained in him. Not a memory, not a recollection, but a quality. A specific gravity. The way certain objects have a specific gravity even in water. A tendency to be drawn towards certain directions, certain kinds of moments, certain qualities in other people that he had no conscious reason to find significant. He had been emptied of the content of himself. The shape of himself had proved more resilient. And the shape, eventually, would be enough for the world to find him. Let the air come back in gently. Feel the physical reality of where you are, the surface you are lying on, the temperature of the space around you, the weight of your own body distributed across the points of contact. These are your anchors. They are real, and they are sufficient, and they are here. What you are about to follow is a return, a story about coming back to yourself after a long absence, which is a story that most people know something about, in one form or another, even if the terms of the absence were considerably less extreme. The fragments surfaced slowly, not as memories exactly. Reynolds had no access to his memories in any conventional sense, but as tendencies, as inclinations, as the quality of a man whose entire interior life had been organized around a specific set of experiences, now manifesting those experiences as personality without having access to their content. He was drawn to high places. He found large rooms comfortable in a way that contradicted the life he was living at ground level. He had a facility with other people's crises that did not feel like a learned skill, but like something he had simply always been able to do. He dreamed sometimes of a light that came from inside rather than outside, and woke with a quality of loss that he had no information to attach to. He was living in reduced circumstances in the period before his rediscovery, without the watchtower, without any of the infrastructure that had previously organized his existence, without any of the relationships that had anchored him. He had, in the absence of the memory of why his life had previously been arranged the way it was, allowed it to collapse to something much simpler and much smaller. He was, in a specific and painful sense, the man he had been before the formula, the man who moved through the world in the way that people do when they have decided the world does not particularly notice whether they move through it or not. Except that this version of that man had a quality in him that the original had not yet had. The sense of something enormous that had been set aside and not entirely forgotten, pressing against the underside of the ordinary life with a persistence that the ordinary life could not entirely absorb. It was the new Avengers who found him. The circumstances of the discovery are, like much in Reynolds' story, somewhat contested in their specifics, but the essential architecture is clear. Someone found evidence of the Sentry's prior existence that had survived the erasure in a form that Reynolds had not anticipated. A journal, a record, a thread that, when pulled, began to reveal a shape behind it. The Avengers followed the thread with the specific combination of urgency and caution that you bring to anything that has been deliberately hidden by someone with the power to hide things effectively, because the very thoroughness of the hiding tells you something significant about the importance of what is hidden. The moment of re-emergence, the moment when Reynolds' memories returned to him, was, by accounts of everyone present, more devastating than triumphant. It was not the clean revelation of a mystery solved. It was the experience of having everything that had been absent return at once, without preparation, without the gradual acclimation that the original experiences had provided. He did not get to fall in love with Lindy again slowly. He did not get to build his friendship with Reed over a series of afternoons. He did not get to discover that Peter Parker was unexpectedly funny in small doses. He got all of it back in the same instant, compressed into a pressure that the body was not designed to receive without consequence. He remembered everything, including the reason he had removed it. The heroes remembered simultaneously. This is one of the more disorienting aspects of what Reynolds had done, that the memories he had removed from the people who loved him returned to all of them at once, without warning, in whatever context they happened to be in. Reed Richards, in the middle of something entirely unrelated, was suddenly possessed of a complete and detailed knowledge of a man he had considered one of his closest friends, and had, until that moment, had absolutely no recollection of ever meeting. Tony Stark's filing system suddenly contained a vast and fully detailed record of a person who, minutes before, had not existed in any of them. The collective disorientation was significant, not painful in any physical sense, but cognitively radical, the equivalent of discovering that a substantial portion of your autobiography has been redacted and is now, without transition, fully restored. Lindy's face, when Reynolds saw her after the return, is described in the accounts that survive as containing several things simultaneously. Relief at a scale that has no gradations, grief for the time that had been removed, anger that was entirely justified and entirely contained within the larger structure of the love that was also present, and something that resists categorization, something that looked like the specific exhaustion of a person who has been missing something without knowing they were missing it, and is now experiencing the restoration and the cost of the absence at the same time. She remembered him. She remembered everything. She also remembered the conversation in which he had told her what he was going to do, which meant she remembered, in full and with complete clarity, having agreed to let him do it. This did not make the anger less justified. It made it more complicated. The conversations that followed the return had a texture distinct from anything in the earlier chapters of the story. They were not the conversations of people rebuilding a relationship from scratch. The relationship had not been destroyed, only suspended, and the suspension had not changed the fundamental architecture of what existed between them. But they were conversations between people who now shared a specific knowledge that they had not shared before. That Reynolds had determined, on his own, that the relationship and everything else in his life was something that could be temporarily sacrificed for the greater purpose of preventing the void from operating. Lindy accepted this. She also, without saying so explicitly, made clear that the calculation should not be made a second time without her. The reintegration into the hero community was, predictably, neither smooth nor simple. Reynolds returned to a landscape that had, in his absence, reorganized itself around a different set of assumptions. His absence having been so thorough that no contingency planning had been done for his return, because no one had known there was anything to plan for. He was present again, which was good. He was also, demonstrably, a man who had once determined that the most responsible course of action was to remove himself from everyone's life and memory, which raised questions about what he might determine again in the future. The heroes who loved him most were also the heroes who were most aware of this arithmetic. World War Hulk put him in proximity to Bruce Banner's darkest incarnation in circumstances that no one had planned, and that revealed something in both of them, that their more conventional interactions had kept somewhat obscured. The World-Breaker Hulk at that moment was a being of grief, operating at the magnitude of a planet, not simply a creature of physical power, but a consciousness that had been pushed past the point where grief and rage are distinguishable from each other. The Sentry, facing him, was a consciousness that knew exactly what it was like to be pushed to a threshold you did not think you would survive, and to have to decide, at that threshold, what kind of thing you were going to let yourself become. They fought, or engaged in something that functions as the vocabulary of fighting without quite being fighting in any ordinary sense. Two beings of incomprehensible magnitude, each carrying in themselves a darkness that was inseparable from what made them what they were, occupying the same space and negotiating in the only language available to them, the question of which darkness had priority. Reynolds won in a technical sense. He also understood, in the specific clarity that sometimes arrives in the middle of extreme physical expenditure, that winning was not the word that applied to what had just happened. What had happened was that two people who were carrying things no one was designed to carry had briefly been in the same room, and one of them had stopped first. What he found in the space afterward, in the quiet of having stopped the Hulk's rampage without knowing entirely how he had done it, was not triumph. It was recognition. The Hulk had been created, as Reynolds had been created, by a process that amplified what was already there, without asking permission, and without installing any mechanism for the result to be safely contained. They were different expressions of the same fundamental problem. What do you do with a being who is too much of something? In a universe that has decided it wants the something without having adequately planned for the too much. The Hulk would go on to carry this question. So would Reynolds. They carried it toward different conclusions. But for one strange afternoon, in the rubble of what the Hulk's grief had made, they carried it together. The specific challenge of reintegrating into a community that has simultaneously forgotten and then remembered you is one without conventional precedent. And the heroes Reynolds returned to were not, in any meaningful sense, identical to the heroes who had known him before the forgetting. They had spent the intervening time having experiences he had not shared, building on understandings his absence had not informed. The Reynolds they had known, and the Reynolds who was present now, were technically the same person. The context in which that person existed was substantially changed, and the change had the quality of something that had to be acknowledged and navigated rather than dissolved by the restoration of shared memory. They all had to learn each other again, in the shadow of having known each other before, which is a stranger and more effortful process than learning someone for the first time. Lindy's decision to recommit to the relationship after the return, and all it implied, deserves more careful attention than the narrative typically provides, because it moves quickly past it in favor of more dramatic material. She had been erased from the knowledge of the man she had organized her life around. She had lived through the period of missing something she could not name. She had had the missing thing returned to her without preparation, and then had been asked, implicitly, by the simple fact of Reynolds's continued existence, to re-enter a relationship whose primary established fact was that her partner had once decided, on her behalf as much as his own, to remove her from his life in order to protect the world from himself. She chose to re-enter it. The choosing was not simple. It was possibly the bravest thing she did for him in the entire span of their time together, and it is the thing the story mentions least. The new Avengers, as a collective, processed the revelation of Reynolds's prior existence in ways that mapped fairly predictably onto their individual characters. Those who defaulted to analysis asked how and why. Those who defaulted to relationship asked who. The tension between these two orientations, between the question of what Reynolds was and the question of who he was, characterized much of his experience in the months following the return. He was simultaneously a phenomenon to be understood and a person to be known, and very few of the people in the room had both the capacity and the inclination to hold those two things simultaneously without letting one crowd out the other. The few who managed it were the ones who mattered most to him, and their ability to manage it was not incidental to why they mattered. Someone was watching. This is the element of the story that is easy to overlook in the drama of the return and the chaos of World War Hulk, and the small, hard-won reconstitution of Reynolds's place in the world, that the return had an audience that none of the principals were aware of. Norman Osborn, in the period that would be called Dark Reign, was building a framework for power that required a very specific kind of asset. Something too powerful to be conventionally controlled, too unstable to be reliable, and therefore perfectly suited to a management style that was not interested in reliability but in the strategic deployment of unpredictability. He was watching Reynolds with the attention of a man who has identified a resource and is calculating the optimal conditions for its extraction. What he was building would take the Golden Man and make something else entirely out of him. And the thing he would make would leave a mark on the Marvel Universe that could not be undone. Let your breath be easy. Let your eyes stay closed. There is nothing here that requires your vigilance. You are a witness to something that has already happened, a reader of a history that is already concluded, a passenger in a story that knows its own shape. What comes next is the chapter that most who knew the Sentry wish had gone differently. But it went the way it went, and the only useful posture toward it now is attention. Let the words arrive. Let them matter in the way that stories about people being failed by systems that should have protected them always matter. Norman Osborn's ascent to institutional power following the events known as the Secret Invasion was one of the more efficient examples of the Marvel Universe's capacity for producing outcomes that look, from the outside, like mistakes of perception and are, from the inside, the entirely predictable results of a system designed to reward whoever wins most recently. Osborn had won. He had been present at the right moment with the right weapon, and the world had done what the world does when it is frightened. It had handed its own protection to the person who had most recently and most dramatically appeared to provide it. Osborn understood exactly how temporary this arrangement was. He had very specific plans for how to make it last. The Dark Avengers were the centerpiece of those plans, an arrangement of people with power and compromised relationships with that power, organized under Osborn's directional authority in a configuration that appeared, from the outside, indistinguishable from the legitimate version of the organization it was replacing. Reynolds was central to the architecture. Osborn's evaluation of the Sentry had been conducted with a coldness that was, in its way, more thoroughly analytical than anything Reed Richards had managed, because Osborn was not distracted by anything resembling affection. He saw Reynolds with complete clarity, a being of incomprehensible power, destabilized by mental illness, without the psychological infrastructure to resist directed influence, and therefore, in Osborn's specific calculus, ideal. The exploitation of Reynolds's mental illness was not crude. Osborn was not stupid, and stupid exploitation would have failed immediately. What Osborn built instead was something more sophisticated, an environment in which Reynolds's illness was accommodated in ways that appeared supportive, and which, by appearing supportive, made Reynolds less rather than more able to evaluate his own situation clearly. Reynolds was given structure. He was given routine. He was given the specific feeling of being needed and being managed, which is a feeling that people who have spent significant time feeling unmoored often experience as a form of care, even when the structure and the routine and the need are organized around someone else's interests entirely. Osborn was not his doctor. He was performing the role of his doctor, for purposes that had nothing to do with Reynolds's health. Being given a uniform and a designation and an operational role within Osborn's structure was, for Reynolds in that period, experienced as something that felt adjacent to stabilization. This is the most painful part of the accounting, that what Osborn was doing to him felt, from inside Reynolds's experience, like help. He was not being coerced in any conventional sense. He was not being forced. He was being managed in the specific way that people who have significant psychological vulnerabilities can be managed by someone who understands those vulnerabilities and is willing to use that understanding as leverage without ever acknowledging that leverage is what it is. Reynolds trusted Osborn in the specific way that people trust the structures that appear to hold them up, without examining too closely what those structures are made of. The things he did under Osborn's directional authority during Dark Reign occupy a section of his history that Reynolds' supporters find difficult to discuss, and his critics find difficult to discuss for different reasons. He used his power in service of ends that the earlier version of himself would have recognized as ends he had opposed. He was present at the implementation of decisions that the Golden Man in the Watchtower would never have countenanced. He did not experience these things as violations of his values, because his values, in that period, had been systematically relocated by Osborn's management into a framework where Osborn's authority was the primary reference point. His compass had not been broken. It had been recalibrated to point at someone else's north. Lindy watched this. She was present throughout Dark Reign in the specific capacity of a person who loves someone and watches them being harmed by something they cannot see and cannot persuade them to see. She had, after the Great Forgetting, made an agreement with herself about what she was and was not willing to accept, what she was and was not willing to be complicit in by virtue of remaining. She tested that agreement against what she saw during Dark Reign and found it straining in ways that frightened her. She was not without resources. She also was not in a position to do what needed doing, which was to remove Reynolds from Osborn's environment before the environment finished what it had started. The gap between understanding a danger and being able to address it is one of the most well-documented forms of helplessness. Lindy lived in that gap. The void was gaining ground. This is the thread that runs beneath the Dark Reign period, below the politics and the institutional drama and the specifics of what Osborn was directing Reynolds to do. The void was advancing. Reynolds' psychological destabilization, which Osborn was both exploiting and actively contributing to, was functioning as a kind of erosion on the boundary between the Sentry and the void. Every compromise, every use of power in service of ends that the deeper self did not endorse, every morning in which the person he was in Osborn's structure was slightly less recognizable as the person he had been in the Watchtower. All of this was working at a level that no psychological instrument available could measure, as a reduction in the structural integrity of what was keeping the two halves of Reynolds' self in their respective positions. The dissolution of the Robert Reynolds self during this period is one of those processes that is visible only in retrospect, because it was happening at a level of granularity that made each individual increment invisible. He was still recognizably himself. He was still capable of the friendship, the humor, the specific quality of attention that people who loved him found irreplaceable. But the self that was being present in those moments was becoming, week by week, something slightly more performed and slightly less inhabited. He was, in the way that people sometimes are, when they have been required to be someone slightly different for a very long time, becoming the performance. The interior was retreating to make room for the role, and the void was moving into the space the interior was vacating. Sit with the particular horror of this for a moment. Not the horror of violence or of dramatic failure, but the quieter horror of watching someone you love become less themselves through a process too gradual to point to clearly, too diffuse to name precisely. too entangled with things that look like support to address directly. This is a horror that the people in Reynolds' life experienced, Lindy, Reed, Peter, in the specific way that witnesses to a slow erosion experience it. With the frustration of seeing a destination they can identify and being unable to prevent the trajectory toward it. They were not powerless. They were also not powerful enough. The void required only that the conditions in Reynolds' life continue to move in the direction they were moving. Osborn was happy to ensure they did. The point of no return, the specific threshold after which the question was no longer whether but only when, arrived without announcement. Reynolds crossed it in the way that people cross these thresholds. Not in a moment of visible significance, but in the middle of a moment that looked like any other, in which something in the interior gave way that had been under tension for a long time, and the world continued around him without having noticed. He did not feel different immediately. He would not feel different until he arrived at Asgard. But the void had cleared the last obstacle between its own intentions and the open air. Whatever Robert Reynolds had been, whatever the Sentry had been, those things were still present in the building. They were no longer in charge of the locks. Thor saw it first. This is significant because Thor's sight is not primarily analytical in the way that Richards's sight is analytical, or perceptive in the way that Parker's perception is perceptive. Thor sees the way that people who have lived very long, lives in proximity to cosmic-scale forces, learn to see, in terms of what a thing actually is, beneath what it is presenting itself as. What Thor saw in Reynolds during the period leading to Asgard was not the Golden Man, not the friendly colleague, not the uncertain but fundamentally good person that most of the people around Reynolds were still primarily seeing. What Thor saw was the specific quality of a thing that has been hollowed of its original occupant and is now being driven by something else entirely. He mentioned it to no one. He was not yet sure what he was seeing. He was not yet sure it was his to say. The specific architecture of Osborn's management becomes clearer in retrospect than it was in real time, and the clarity is not comfortable. Osborn understood, with the precision of someone who has made a careful study of human vulnerability, that the most effective control is the kind that does not feel like control, that presents itself as care, as structure, as the provision of what is genuinely needed. He gave Reynolds the experience of being held together by an external framework at the precise moment when Reynolds's internal framework was at its most fragile. He gave him the feeling of mattering to an institution at the moment when Reynolds's relationship to his own significance was at its most uncertain. The dependency this created was not a side effect. It was the mechanism. Osborn was not accidentally good at this. He had built it deliberately, from a specific assessment of what Reynolds needed and a complete willingness to provide the appearance of it in service of something entirely different. The people who attempted to reach Reynolds during this period, and there were people who made the attempt despite the institutional barriers Osborn had positioned around him, found that the Reynolds they encountered was recognizable but not entirely present. He engaged with them. He remembered them. The specific memories were accessible. But something in the quality of the engagement suggested that the processing of the input was being routed through a layer that had not previously been there, as if a filter had been installed, gradually and without announcement, between Reynolds and the experience of being in contact with people who knew him genuinely. Peter Parker, who visited him twice during this period and left both times with an unease he could not entirely articulate, later described it as the feeling of talking to someone through glass that was not visible but was audible in the specific quality of the silence between sentences. What the Void was doing during the Dark Reign period, at the level below what any available instrument could measure, was experiencing the steady reduction of the resistance that had always kept it on the interior side of the boundary between itself and expression. Reynolds' stability was that resistance. His relationships were that resistance. His morning routines with Lindy, his conversations with Reed, Parker's unannounced visits, these were the resistance in the specific sense that they renewed, daily, the sense that the world was worth orienting toward rather than away from. Osborn had not eliminated these things. He had reduced their frequency, introduced competing demands that made them harder to sustain, and then waited for the Void's patience to do what patience does when the resistance is being quietly worn down. The Void had always been willing to wait. The conditions Osborn had created made the wait shorter. Asgard was waiting. The Golden City, relocated to the plains of Oklahoma in the aftermath of the Ragnarok cycle, a detail so strange that it has the quality of something that could only exist in a universe where strangeness has been normalized, was waiting for the reckoning that Osborn had decided it represented. What Osborn wanted in Asgard was what Osborn always wanted. The consolidation of power in a form that could not be challenged by the existing distribution of power. He needed something to breach the city. He needed something that the city's defenders could not stop. He needed, in short, the Void wearing the Sentry's face, directed at a target that Reynolds himself would never have chosen. He was about to get exactly that. And what happened when he got it was going to require a god to end it. Your breath is the only thing required of you right now. Let it be slow, and let it be even. What follows is the culmination, the point toward which the entire architecture of the Sentry's story has been moving since the night a man in a desperate place drank from a container he should not have touched. Stories like this do not peak gently, but you are safe here. You are outside the story, not inside it. Let the words come, and let them pass through you without catching. The March on Asgard was organized under the pretense of national security, which is the institutional language that gets used when the actual reasons are not the sort that survive public examination. Osborn had constructed a justification that was technically coherent if you did not examine its premises too closely, and he had delivered it to the relevant authorities in a manner calibrated to prevent close examination. The force he assembled was significant. What made it overwhelming was not its scale, but its leading element, Robert Reynolds, in the uniform of the Sentry, walking toward the gates of a city that housed gods. Asgard above Oklahoma had a quality that defied the easy vocabulary of either magical or architectural description. It was a city built at a scale that made human urban planning look like the arrangement of furniture in a small room. Its towers caught light at angles that suggested the light had been specifically designed to be caught that way. Its walls had the quality of things built by people for whom the concept of destruction was something that happened to other things, not to their structures. It had been placed on the American plain with a disregard for the surrounding geography that was not arrogance, but simply the natural expression of something that did not require context to justify its own existence. It was magnificent. What was about to happen to it was the opposite of that. Reynolds was not fully present in himself by the time they reached the city. This is the description that the people who witnessed it consistently reach for. He was present in the physical sense, embodied, moving, operating, but the quality of consciousness behind the eyes was different from the quality that the people who knew him had come to recognize as him. It was not absent. It was replaced. What looked out from behind his face in those minutes was something that had Reynolds's capabilities, and none of his hesitations. Reynolds's power, and none of his carefulness. Reynolds's strength, and none of the restraint that had always been what made the strength something other than catastrophic. The void had arrived at the surface. Robert Reynolds was still in there somewhere. He was not in charge. Ares was among the defenders who responded. The god of war, violent, precise, ancient in the specific way that things are ancient when they have been tested, rather than simply preserved, understood immediately and with a clarity that derived from his specific expertise what he was facing. Not the Sentry, not the Golden Man. Something wearing the Golden Man's form that had none of the Golden Man's particular quality of reluctance. Ares had fought beside Reynolds enough times to know the difference between Reynolds at full power and whatever was standing in Reynolds's place. He engaged it the way you engage something when you understand that negotiation is not available and that the outcome is not guaranteed. Completely, without reservation, and without the specific caution that is required when you care about what you might damage on the way to the conclusion. What happened in those moments between Ares's engagement and what followed is recorded in the accounts of those who witnessed it with the specific quality of language that people use when what they are describing does not quite fit into the categories. Language was built to describe. It was over very quickly. Ares, the god of war, one of the oldest and most ferocious combatants in a universe filled with ancient and ferocious combatants, was not killed. The word killed implies a process, a duration, an engagement with consequence. What happened to Ares was more immediate than that. The void, at full capacity, does not fight. It concludes. The conclusion was brutal, and it was permanent, and it altered the understanding of everyone who witnessed it. Whatever had come through that gate was not the Sentry. The Sentry did not do things like that. The Sentry had never done anything like that. This was what the void looked like without a container. The assembled heroes who arrived in the aftermath, the legitimate Avengers, the forces that had been moving toward Asgard in response to Osborn's assault, the heroes who had spent years knowing Robert Reynolds and caring about him, arrived to a situation that the training and experience they had accumulated between them had not fully prepared them for. They were facing the void at full expression, in the body of the most powerful being any of them had ever encountered, in the middle of a city of gods that it was actively destroying. The tactics that apply to containing a powerful villain do not apply to containing something that is made of the same substance as the power it is wielding. There was no exterior to engage. There was only Reynolds, somewhere inside it, and the question of what could reach him through the noise. Thor's arrival changed the calculus of the situation in a way that was not immediately about power. Thor's power was significant, genuinely so. Thor could survive things that would end most beings in the universe, could sustain engagement at a level that most combatants could not. But Thor's power was not what changed the calculus. What changed it was what Thor knew, which was what he had seen in the preceding weeks. That the Reynolds he was facing was not a version of Reynolds that could be reasoned with, or reached or persuaded to stop. It was the version that Reynolds had spent his entire heroic life trying to prevent from being expressed. Trying to reason with it would have required time that the city did not have. Thor made a calculation that was also a grief. The blow Thor delivered was not made in anger. This distinction matters, though it is subtle and easily lost in the drama of the physical event. Mjolnir's impact at that scale would have been cataclysmic, regardless of the emotional state of the person swinging it. The physics did not require anger to be catastrophic. But the absence of anger, the presence instead of something closer to sorrow, is documented in every account by the people who were watching Thor's face. He knew what he was doing. He knew what it cost. He did it anyway, because the alternative was to allow something that Robert Reynolds had spent his entire existence trying to prevent to continue operating in the world unchecked. And that was the one outcome Reynolds, the actual Reynolds, would have considered unacceptable. The dissolution happened at a speed that made it difficult to process as a sequence of events. The Void, confronted with a force sufficient to end its current expression, did not fight the conclusion the way organic things fight conclusions. It released the specific quality of the darkness that had been the Void, its density, its intention, its occupation of the space that Reynolds's body provided, dispersed in a way that witnesses reached for the language of weather to describe. Not an explosion, but a sudden absence, the way the pressure drops before a storm, and then the storm is simply over. What remained was light, not the golden, concentrated light of the Sentry at full power. A softer light, the light of something very large releasing. In those last seconds, the seconds between Thor's blow and the final dissolution, there are accounts, varying in their confidence and their specificity, of something in Reynolds that was recognizable as Reynolds. Not the Void, not the performance of the Sentry. Something quieter and more specific than either. The quality of a person who has been somewhere very dark for a very long time and is, finally, in the last available moment, briefly again in the presence of light. The accounts of this moment read as if those who were present are not entirely sure they saw what they think they saw, and are also not entirely willing to dismiss it. Whatever it was, it lasted for the duration of a breath. And then the light expanded and dispersed, and the sky above the ruins of Asgard was simply sky again. Reed Richards, in the aftermath, sat with the specific quality of grief that comes from having failed to prevent something that your intellect tells you should have been able to prevent. He was aware of the calculation he had not made in time, the connection between what he had observed in Reynolds and what Reynolds had been building toward, and the awareness was not comfortable. Tony Stark withdrew from the site in a silence that was unlike his customary processing of difficult outcomes, which was usually not silent. Peter Parker did not withdraw. He stayed in the area long after the practical reasons for staying had concluded, doing what Parker does when he cannot fix something, staying near it, being a witness, refusing to make the loss comfortable by leaving. The physical scale of what the Void expressed above Asgard in those minutes resists ordinary description, not because the language of power is insufficient, but because what the Void was doing did not operate in the same register as the things that the language of power was built to describe. It was not more powerful than the assembled defenders in the way that one combatant can be more powerful than another. It was operating in a different category of event, not a battle, but a revision. It was retroactively reducing the reality of things, treating the city's existence as a proposal it had decided to reject. The defenders who attempted conventional engagement found that conventional frameworks produced results that were insufficient in ways they had not previously encountered. The Void was not fighting back. It was simply continuing, with a thoroughness that made fighting back a concept that did not quite apply. Thor's approach carried the quality of a decision that had been made before the moment arrived. He had been carrying the weight of what might be required since the weeks before, since the first time he had identified in Reynolds's face the specific quality of occupancy that was not Reynolds's occupancy. He had not shared that identification publicly. He had held it in the way that people hold something they are not yet ready to act on, while the situation moved toward the point where action would be unavoidable. When the point arrived, Thor was not improvising. He was executing a decision he had hoped he would never have to execute, with the completeness that a decision made long in advance and lived with carefully is executed. The grief and the will were both fully present. Neither was compromising the other. The heroes who assembled in the aftermath carried themselves with a formality that was not their usual register. They were methodical. They spoke in measured tones. They attended to the immediate practical necessities of the situation with a precision that did not usually characterize their post-crisis behavior. What they were doing, without having organized it or named it, was being as worthy as they could manage of what they had just witnessed. A being who had spent his entire existence trying to prevent a specific outcome had died in the process of preventing it. The formality was the only language available to them for saying that they understood this, and that they recognized it was worth something that their ordinary vocabulary had not been built to hold. What remained of Robert Reynolds' story was not, as it turned out, a conclusion. The body that had dissolved into light above Oklahoma, the body that had housed both the most powerful being in the Marvel Universe and the darkness that had destroyed a city of gods, did not remain dissolved. The formula that Reynolds had consumed in that laboratory all those years ago had not included a provision for staying dead. What it had included was a provision for continuation that exceeded what any ordinary biological system was capable of. The light above Asgard dispersed. Somewhere, in a form that none of the people who had witnessed the dissolution could have immediately predicted, what had been Robert Reynolds was already beginning to accumulate again. The universe had one more word to say about the Sentry. It was not finished with him yet. And he was not, however much the evidence suggested otherwise, finished with the universe. Come back into the quiet. There is no urgency here, only the soft arrival of understanding, which is a different thing from knowing and a slower one. You have followed a story of extraordinary power and extraordinary suffering and the long, complicated distance between the two. And now, the story pauses to do what stories at their best always do, to ask what it means, not to provide a tidy answer. Answers are for simpler stories. This one offers something else, a way of looking at what happened that allows it to illuminate something you already know, from the inside, about being the kind of creature that carries more inside it than it was designed to hold. The Sentry is, at the level of theme, a story about the relationship between power and psychological stability, and the specific, uncomfortable proposition that these two things do not necessarily accompany each other. The tradition of superhero storytelling tends to assume a correlation, that the person who has been given extraordinary capability has also, by some mechanism, either genetic or moral, or simply narrative, been given the interior stability to carry it responsibly. Rogers has both. Stark built both. Parker earned both, painfully, through loss that functioned as tuition. The Sentry violated this expectation in a way that the Marvel Universe found genuinely difficult to accommodate, because he had the power without having had any of the development that the tradition expects to accompany it. He was a god who had not been educated as one. The Void's nature, the specific thing it was and was not, is worth sitting with carefully, because the easiest interpretation is also the least accurate. The easiest interpretation is that the Void was evil, that it was an antagonist, a villain, a separate malevolent entity that had found a host and was attempting to use that host against his own will. This interpretation is comfortable because it gives the story a villain, and stories with villains have a shape that is easier to navigate than stories without them. The more accurate interpretation is considerably less comfortable. The Void was Reynolds's own darkness, amplified to the magnitude of his power. It was the shadow that his specific kind of light could not avoid casting. It was not separate from him. It was the most honest version of him, in the specific sense that it expressed what he carried without any of the suppression he had spent his entire life maintaining. Every person who has ever experienced the gap between who they want to be and who they feel they are at their worst recognizes something in this, the distance between the performed self and the interior self, between the self that operates in the presence of other people and the self that operates in the small hours when no one is watching, is a distance that most people manage through a combination of effort and structure, and the specific anchors that other people provide. Reynolds had those anchors. He had built them carefully and maintained them with extraordinary dedication. What he could not do was make them sufficient to a darkness that was proportional to a power no structure in the universe had been built to hold. The particular cruelty of his situation was not the darkness itself, but the dynamic between the darkness and everything else. The more he loved Lindy, Reed, Peter, the collection of relationships that represented the functional equivalent of all his internal weight placed on the lighter side of the scale, the more the darkness amplified, because the darkness was the other side of the same capacity. His ability to feel the warmth of those relationships was the same ability, expressed differently, as the Void's ability to negate. You cannot have one without the other. The formula had made him capable of extraordinary light, and had made him, by the same operation, capable of extraordinary dark. The question of which one expressed at any given moment was a question of conditions, of what was maintaining the equilibrium, and how close the equilibrium was to its own edge. What the Sentry looks like, when viewed through the lens of what we now understand about mental illness at any scale, is a person who had a significant psychological vulnerability that was present before any of the extraordinary circumstances of his life, which was then amplified by those circumstances to a degree that made the ordinary management tools, the relationships, the structure, the deliberate cultivation of anchoring conditions, unable to carry the weight that was being placed on them. He was not failed by his relationships. His relationships were the most significant factor in how long the equilibrium held. He was failed by a universe that gave him a power without providing the support infrastructure that power required, by a system represented most clearly by Osborn but not exclusive to him, that found it expedient to exploit his vulnerability rather than address it, and by the specific cruelty of a formula that had not been designed with his well-being as a parameter. The modern echo, the place where this story touches the ordinary world with enough precision to be felt rather than simply acknowledged, is in what happens when extraordinary capacity and insufficient support are combined in a single person. You have known people like this. Not at the scale of a god, not in the specific terms of golden light and cosmic darkness, but in the recognizable human versions of the same configuration. The person who is capable of more than anyone else in the room, and who carries that capability without the structure needed to sustain it, the person whose greatest strengths and most significant struggles are not opposites but the same phenomenon expressed in different directions. The person for whom the relationships that keep them oriented are not additions to their life, but the primary architecture of their stability. You have known versions of this. You may be a version of it. The Sentry is not other, he is amplified. Lindy's role in his story, viewed through this lens, becomes something other than the conventional supporting character function she is sometimes assigned. She was not simply the person who loved him. She was, in the specific engineering of his psychology, a critical load-bearing element of the structure that was the difference between the Sentry and the Void. Her presence, her consistency, her willingness to know him clearly and choose him anyway, these were not decorative. They were functional in the deepest sense, the sense that a foundation is functional. When the foundation was compromised, first by the Great Forgetting, then by the Osborn period, what failed was not simply the relationship. What failed was the structural integrity of the self that the relationship had been holding in place. Reed Richards and Tony Stark occupied a different but equally structural role. They gave Reynolds something that Lindy could not give him, not because she was insufficient, but because what they provided was specific. The experience of being treated as an intellectual equal, as a subject of genuine serious interest, as a person whose interiority mattered to minds that he respected. Reynolds had, before the formula, no experience of being taken seriously in that way. The relationships with Richards and Stark told him, consistently and in the specific language of sustained attention, that he was worth the effort of understanding. This was, for Reynolds, a form of stabilization as real as any other. Its loss during the period of his erasure was not simply a social loss. It was a structural one. The failure of every anchor in the end is not an argument against the value of anchors. This is the point that the Sentry story most urgently needs to make, and makes most quietly, and is most often missed in the drama of the collapse. The anchors held for a very long time. They held under conditions that no anchor in the history of the world had ever been tested against. They held until the conditions became specifically designed to undermine them. The duration of what the Golden Years represented, the real, sustained, livable stability that Reynolds achieved and maintained for a significant period of his existence, is not erased by the fact that it eventually ended. The ending does not retroactively void the existence. The stability was real. It was real for years. That is not nothing. That is in fact the most important thing. What the world does with power it cannot contain is one of the oldest questions in the story of organized human life, and the Sentry's story offers an answer that is more honest than comfortable. It fails. Not always, not inevitably. But consistently, in the absence of the specific conditions required to sustain the equilibrium, the power goes where power without adequate containment always goes, toward its own expression, regardless of consequence. The institutions that encountered the Sentry, SHIELD, the Avengers, Osborn's apparatus, all made variations of the same error, which was to treat Reynolds as a resource rather than a person. They wanted the power. They were not interested in the conditions required to keep the power's container stable. This is a familiar kind of institutional failure. It is not specific to fictional universes. Sit with what the Sentry ultimately offers. Not the spectacle of the collapse, not the drama of the siege, not the image of the most powerful being in the world being brought down by a god with a hammer. These are the parts of the story that are easy to see. What is harder to see, and what is worth the effort of seeing, is what the Sentry offers as a mirror. That power and vulnerability are not opposites. That the capacity for extraordinary good and the capacity for catastrophic harm can exist in the same person, in the same moment, separated only by the presence or absence of the specific conditions that make the good one express instead of the other one. That stability is not a given. It is a structure, and structures require maintenance and support and the sustained attention of people who understand what they are maintaining. The question of what adequate support for Reynolds might have looked like, what the institutional and personal landscape of the Marvel Universe would have needed to provide in order for the story to have concluded differently, is not an idle one. It has practical contours. He needed, at minimum, a consistent clinical relationship with someone who had both the expertise to understand the specific form his psychological vulnerability took and the access to monitor its fluctuations over time. He needed an institutional structure organized around his stability as a primary, operational concern rather than treating his stability as an assumption and his power as the resource to be extracted. He needed, most fundamentally, for the people who benefited from his capability to take proportional responsibility for the conditions that made the capability sustainable. None of these things were adequately provided. The gap between what was provided and what was needed is not incidental to the story. It is the story. The broader pattern that the Sentry's story surfaces, the pattern of capability without adequate support, of extraordinary power paired with insufficient structural investment in the psychology of the person who holds it, is not specific to fictional universes. It recurs in the Marvel framework with a consistency that suggests it is structural rather than accidental. The universe keeps generating beings of extreme capacity and insufficient containment. The universe keeps being surprised when the combination produces outcomes that investment might have prevented. Reynolds is not the first person this pattern has produced. He is simply the one for whom the scale made the consequences impossible to overlook. The lesson is legible in his story. The learning of it, within the fictional world and beyond it, is, as of this accounting, a project that remains ongoing. He could not stay dead, which tells you something the story has been building towards since the beginning, that the resolution was never going to be the Sentry's absence. The question was never how to end him. It was always how to hold him. The universe had not yet found the answer when Thor's blow dissolved him above the ruins of Asgard. It would not find the answer in the months that followed. But the question had been asked with sufficient precision that the universe could not stop asking it. And Robert Reynolds, wherever the dissolution had sent him, had not yet said everything he had come to say. The light that had dispersed above Oklahoma was not extinguished. It was between statements. What it would say next was already forming, in whatever space exists between expressions of something that does not know how to end. Let yourself be very still now. Let the breath come in slowly and release without effort. You have followed this story through all of its rooms, the bright ones and the dark ones, the rooms of gold and the rooms that had no light at all. And you are arriving now at the last room, which is not quite an ending, but is something close enough to rest. Let the weight of what you have heard settle around you like something warm. You are still here. The story is still here. What comes next is quieter than what came before. And quiet, after all of this, is exactly what is required. The first resurrection came quietly, and without the announcement that the scale of what Reynolds was might have warranted. There was no dramatic emergence, no singular moment of reconstitution that those who had been present at the dissolution were called to witness. Reynolds simply became present again, not in the same form, not in the same configuration, but present in the fundamental sense that the energy and the consciousness and the particular arrangement of what he was had not dispersed into nothing, but had instead moved through the dissolution to somewhere else. The formula had not been designed with a terminus. This, as it turned out, was not an oversight. The reason that Robert Reynolds cannot stay dead is not a narrative convenience. It is, within the logic of what the formula built, a structural property of what he is. Ordinary biological death requires that the systems maintaining a living body fail past a point of recovery. Reynolds's systems do not fail past that point because the formula removed the concept of that point from his biological architecture. He does not die in the way that organic things die. He disrupts. The specific arrangement of energy and consciousness that constitutes him disperses from its current form, and then, in a time frame that appears to be determined by factors that no analysis has yet successfully identified, it reconstitutes. He is not immortal in the casual sense. He is something more specific and more uncomfortable than immortal. He is a pattern of energy that has not yet found a stable form of expression, and which therefore continues expressing until it does. The entity known as the confluctor, one of the explanatory frameworks that emerged in the Marvel Universe's attempts to account for Reynolds's continued existence, after events that should, by any conventional accounting, have concluded it, represents one answer to the question of what maintains the Sentry's continuity across what would be, for any other being, terminal interruptions. The confluctor is not a comfortable concept. It implies that Reynolds's existence is sustained by something outside himself, something that has its own relationship to the question of whether he continues, something whose purposes are not necessarily aligned with his own wishes on the subject. He did not choose to keep coming back. Something chose it for him. This is not the first time in his story that the most important decisions about his existence were made without his input. The cycle of dissolution and return has a quality that the people who have been close to Reynolds across multiple iterations of it describe as something between tragedy and recursion. The experience of watching someone you love arrive at the same threshold from different directions, each time with sufficient variation in the path to make the outcome feel uncertain, even when an experience has made it statistically predictable. He dies in forms that should be final. He returns. The return is not a reset. He carries the history of each dissolution forward, however imperfectly, however filtered through the specific distortions that the process of reconstitution introduces. He comes back changed. He comes back still himself. These two things are always true simultaneously, and their simultaneous truth is part of what makes the cycle so difficult to conclude. Thor's grief about the Sentry, the specific quality of it, distinguishable from the grief that follows a simply irreversible loss, has the character of something that does not fully conclude because the thing being grieved does not fully conclude. Thor has never had to hold the uncomplicated certainty that Reynolds is gone. Every time the dissolution has appeared final, something has returned to make it less than final. The grief is therefore perpetual in a specific sense. It cannot move through its natural stages, because the stages are disrupted by the subject's refusal to remain absent. Thor carries this with a steadiness that is not the same as comfort. He understands perhaps better than anyone who was present at the dissolution above Asgard, that what he ended in that moment and what exists now are not the same configuration, and yet are also not entirely different ones. Reed Richards's response to Reynolds's continued existence has been, predictably, the construction of better frameworks for understanding it. Richards does not grieve in the same register as Thor. His processing of loss and its reversal runs more through the intellect than through the effective channels that are more available to beings who have lived primarily in the emotional landscape. But the calculations he has made regarding the Sentry, and the corrections he has had to make to those calculations when each assumed conclusion proved less than conclusive, represent a kind of intellectual grief. The repeated revision of a model that he believed he understood in the direction of greater complexity, greater uncertainty, and greater acknowledgement of the limits of what his particular instruments can measure. Reynolds has made Reed Richards more humble. This is not a small thing. The heroes who hold Reynolds's memory in the current landscape of the Marvel Universe carry it with a specificity that suggests it functions as something other than purely historical knowledge. It is not simply information about what happened. It is a reference point, a marker at the edge of what the universe permits, that shapes how they approach certain kinds of questions. When a new situation arises that involves extraordinary power without adequate containment, someone in the room often thinks of Reynolds. The lesson that the Sentry represents is not explicitly stated. It does not need to be. It has been written into the experience of everyone who was present for any portion of his story, in a form that does not require conscious recall to operate. He has become part of the framework through which a generation of heroes makes sense of what they are doing, and why. Peter Parker carries his memory in the way that Parker carries most of the significant losses in his life, not as a wound that reopens, but as a presence. Something known, something kept, something that informs the choices made in the present without requiring the past to be relitigated in order to do its work. Parker does not talk about Reynolds often. When he does, what he says tends to be about the unexpected humor, the quality of attention, the sense of someone fully present with you, in a way that the magnitude of what they were carrying should have made impossible. Parker remembers the human things first, the extraordinary things second. This is consistent with Parker's approach to almost everyone he has loved. It is, in retrospect, the approach that served Reynolds best. Lindy's Long Aftermath is a story that the primary narrative of the Sentry often fails to tell with full attention, because the primary narrative is organized around Reynolds himself. And Lindy's story in its later chapters is a story of a person attempting to reconstitute a life around an absence that is not quite an absence. She knew, after each dissolution, that he was not entirely gone. She also could not organize her life around the probability of his return, because the probability, while historically significant, was not certainty, and people cannot maintain their interior life in a state of perpetual held breath. She lived. She carried what she carried. She kept what she kept. The specifics of how she managed the years between his dissolutions and his returns are not fully recorded, which is its own kind of answer to what that experience was like. What the Sentry represents in the larger architecture of the Marvel Universe is, by this point in the accounting, something that can be stated with a degree of precision that his earlier chapters did not permit. He is the limit case. He is what you get when the proposition that power can be given without the development of the person who holds it is taken to its absolute extreme. He is the universe's answer to the question it never quite intended to ask. What does it look like when the most powerful being who has ever existed is also the most vulnerable, in the specific sense of having the least structural support between what they can do and what that doing might become? The answer is, it looks like this. It looks like a man standing at a door he cannot open, protecting the world from himself. It looks like a golden light that cannot stop returning because it does not know how to conclude. Let yourself become very still now. The story is settling. You have been inside a life that was too large for the forms available to contain it. Too much light, too much dark, too much love offered, and too much love complicated by what the loving was building around. You do not need to resolve this tonight. Stories like this are not designed to resolve. They are designed to be carried, held in some interior space where they continue to do their quiet work of illuminating the things that are harder to see in your own experience without something external to reflect them. Let it sit. Let it be what it is. The Golden Man is somewhere in the architecture of the Marvel Universe right now. In whatever form the current iteration of his existence has taken, he is still trying to do what he always tried to do, to bring the weight of what he is towards something useful. Something good, something that justifies the enormity of the power he was never asked if he wanted. He is still watching himself from the inside. He is still the most powerful, and in a very specific sense, the most fragile being in any room he enters. He is still standing at thresholds. Some of them he crosses. Some of them he does not. The ones he does not cross are not the failures of his story. They are perhaps its most significant achievements. Let your breathing slow now to something that is less breath than drift. Let the images of this story, the golden light, the small apartment, the watchtower at morning, Lindy's face, the ruins above Asgard, the light dispersing, and then always returning, let them soften at the edges until they have the texture of something half-remembered rather than fully known. You do not need to hold them tightly. They will be there when you return to them, and you do not need to return to them tonight. Tonight, all that is asked is that you be here, in the warmth of where you are, in the quiet of what this moment is, in the simplicity of a body that is resting, and a mind that is slowing, and a breath that is finding its way, without effort, towards sleep. The watchtower is quiet now. CELOC maintains its watch over systems that no longer require watching, in a building whose warmth was arranged by someone who loved the light. The door Reynolds stood at, the one he could not cross, has been standing open for a long time, now that there is no one standing at it. The traffic below has settled. The city breathes. The story has come to rest in the place where all stories that are honest about their own weight eventually come to rest. Not in conclusion, but in the quality of after. The specific human quality of having been in the presence of something that mattered, and carrying that mattering forward into the quiet. If this story stayed with you tonight, if it arrived somewhere real inside you and left something there, then let it rest too. The golden light is still out there, somewhere. It does not need your attention to persist. It just needs you to have known that it was real. Sleep now. Let the dark be kind. It usually is when you let it. If this video found its way to you tonight, I am glad it did. Let me know in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I am always genuinely curious about that. And if you have a story you would like us to explore next, leave it below. We will find our way to it.